and so it will be on the Warwick's YouTube page as well, and it's Warwick's Books is the YouTube page that it's on. So I think I've given everybody a few minutes to get with us. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jeniffer Thompson and then start the conversation. So Jeniffer is a personal branding expert, digital marketing strategist, and host of the Premise podcast. She's an author and speaker who delivers strategy-rich content and actionable tools that educate and empower authors. She and her husband, Chad, co-founded Monkey See Media in 2004 and have been creating award-winning book cover designs and author websites ever since. Jeniffer is co-founder of the San Diego Writers Festival. She serves on the board of the San Diego Memoir Writers Association and is currently writing her coming-of-age memoir. And we're going to find out a little bit about how you can connect with Jeniffer and Charles at the end of the conversation. So with that, I'm going to toss it to you, Jeniffer, and you guys have a great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie.
Yep.
Thanks.
Hi, Charles. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Jeniffer?
I'm really good. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I know everyone's excited to hear a little bit more about this book. I want to read your bio to our viewers, and this is the book, Fabulous, The Day Lincoln Lost. Charles Rosenberg is the author of The Trial and Execution of the Traitor George Washington, as well as the legal thriller Death on a High Floor and its sequels. The credited legal consultant to the TV show LA Law, Boston Legal, The Practice, and The Paper Chase. He was also one of 2 on-air legal analysts for E!Television's coverage of the O.J. Simpson criminal and civil trials. He teaches as an adjunct law professor at Loyola Law School, and he has taught at UCLA, Pepperdine, and Southwestern Law Schools. He practices law in the Los Angeles area and is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Antioch College, where he majored in history. Let's talk about history.
Let's.
Now,
yeah.
We have a lot of history to talk about. Now, please apologize to your wife for this question, but can you still recite Longfellow's The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere?
I should tell you she's in the back of the room and is laughing. Because she's forbidden me to do it.
Has she?
Yeah.
So this tells me that you can still, in fact, recite it.
Oh, yeah. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. And he said to his friend, if the British march from land or sea to from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, etc.
That's
My
awesome.
5th grade teacher made me memorize it.
I think it's incredible what we remember from grade school.
It is.
I remember the first and last names. What's that?
Even the worst kind of doggerel sticks in your brain.
Oh, totally, right? Yeah. So your love of history started very young.
It did. For sure.
I'm curious, when you studied the Revolution primarily, I believe, in college.
Well, I studied American history, but the Revolution was certainly part of it, yeah.
But it was a big part of it. And I guess my question is, when did you realize that you would someday reimagine history or write thrilling novels about what could have been?
I don't think it was all that long ago, really. I've always been fascinated by what I call the what if question, what if some small thing changed? There's that old piece of, I guess I'll call it doggerel, for lack of a nail, the shoe was lost, for lack of a shoe, the horse was lost, etc., till finally the kingdom's lost, right?
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated by how little things can change things. For example, if you take the 2016 election, whether you liked Hillary Clinton or didn't like her or voted for her or didn't vote for her, who would have predicted 2 years before, when she was widely expected to win, that the events in Benghazi, which are a tragedy for the people there, but I think when the diplomatic history of the United States is written, it's not going to be a big chapter, or that she mismanaged her email account, was going to contribute to her losing the presidency. Mm-hmm. So I was fascinated by that. And when I read a little article somewhere about the fact that there'd been a plot to kidnap Washington, I thought to myself, what if it had succeeded?
Yeah.
And that was about, I guess I had that thought about 20 years ago now. So.
Oh, really? Yeah. And that book, which you're referring to, The Trial and Execution of the Traitor George Washington, Did that come out in 2018? Is that right?
Yes.
Just 2 years ago.
Took me 18 years to actually write it. So.
Well, I mean, my gosh, the amount of history that went into this book, I can only imagine that it would take a long time just to bring all the pieces together. And, you know, I'm fascinated. I mean, you must have so much fun researching these characters, you know, because not only are you writing facts, but you're developing relationships. And I mean, I think that's one of the things you're really known for is character development and relationships, but it happens to be placed in our history with small changes.
Well, with small changes that have big consequences sometimes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. How much fun is that?
Terrific fun. You know, you can just sit there and imagine what would have happened. And once you get over the fear of putting words in the mouth of someone like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, then you can have a great deal of fun with it. But frankly, there's a bit of fear in doing that for this first time because they're well-known characters. And if you get it wrong, people are going to notice. I mean, I don't know if anybody really knows what George Washington was truly like, or most people anyway, but they believe they do. And so, and Lincoln is even more so because we've heard so many of his speeches and words and so forth. So it's a bit intimidating to give it a try. But once you get rolling on it, then it's okay. So
I can imagine. You really depict Lincoln as this very affable, very easygoing, and very funny man. And I'm curious, like, how many biographies have you read about Lincoln, and how much did you know about Lincoln before you started writing this book?
Well, I started, the first book I ever read about Lincoln was when I was in grade school. There was a series of books called landmark books. And I read the biography of Lincoln in that landmark book. They were biographies for kids of famous people. And it sort of went on from there. And then in college, I read a lot of Lincoln biographies. And then I read, after college, what are considered kind of the reigning Lincoln works, like David Donald's one-volume biography of Lincoln and a lot of others. And for this book in particular, I read some things I'd never read before because I knew a lot about the Civil War and I knew a lot about Lincoln, but I didn't really know a lot about the election of 1860. I think American history is viewed as, and Lincoln won the election and then we moved on and had a civil war. But I don't think a lot of people know a lot about the election. Like, for example, he had 3 opponents. You know? So
I learned a lot about the election. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's so much that was different back then. And so I found it very fascinating, just all the little facts. And I assume they're facts. I think that's one of the things with historical fiction is the facts have to be true in terms of how things worked. Or is that untrue? Can you make up stuff to add to your plotline?
Yeah, you can make up stuff, but you have to be careful about what you make up. You know, it has to be plausible, what you make up. And some people's plausibility level is different than other people's, you know. So if you write a novel like this and it's read by, let's suppose I was lucky and it was read by 1 million people, there would inevitably be a few thousand people who'd say, that's not believable, you know. And there would be other people who'd say, hopefully more, gosh, it seems like I'm there, you know.
Well, I kept thinking, oh yeah, this could totally happen. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can't help but relate it to how that could happen today. And, you know, in a lot of the ways around the abolitionists and people's perceptions and viewpoints and, you know, not wanting things to change too quickly for fear of what that would happen to the economy. And, you know, so all of those things, I mean, that's a lot to manage and develop a book like this. And it's a fairly thick book. So how long did it take you to write this book?
To actually write it as opposed to researching it, it took on and off about a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But, you know, that included the edit of it because I have a great editor in Peter Joseph at HarperCollins. And it was, you know, it's a process, right? So that's sort of, it took a year basically.
Well, I'd like to ask you about your process, but first, what was the impetus for writing this book? I mean, I know for the George Washington book, you had...
I'm going to tell you the true story, okay?
Okay, good. But I won't tell anyone, I promise. This is just between us.
So I have a great agent at Trident Media named Erica Silverman, okay? Erica's kind of a blunt person. It took me a while to get used to being told what to do. But anyway, I joined up with Erica. So I had written the George Washington novel, Trial and Execution. And I was in Erica's office in New York. And she said to me, it had not yet been published, I think this book that you just wrote is really terrific. And I think you've got another alternative history in you somewhere. And I said, I can't currently think of one. And she said, well, go think of one.
No big deal.
Go think of one. So my wife could tell you I came home to Los Angeles. I said, well, okay, I got to think of one. But the truth is I'd always been interested in the Civil War. And there are a million novels about the Civil War. You could start with, The Red Badge of Courage and move forward to Cold Mountain and so forth. There are probably hundreds of them. But I don't think there are really a lot of novels set in the 1850s or in the election of 1860.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, maybe I'll do something about that. And I just did what I usually do, which is I was reading a bunch of books about it. And I was reading a book, I think its title was 1860. It was about the politics of 1860, what was going on. And I'm reading along, and there's a line in it that says, and there was a meeting, and the famous abolitionist Abby Kelly was there. And I actually said out loud, who? Okay.
Right.
Because I know a fair amount about the abolition movement, and I had never, ever heard of her. Okay. So I went and looked her up, and it turned out she was a person who was seriously famous at the time, who has largely disappeared from popular memory. She was what was referred to as a radical abolitionist. She thought, for example, that the southern states should just go. Okay, this was before the Civil War. Yeah. She thought if you belonged to a church that didn't believe in abolition, you should just leave and go to some other church. She was, I haven't really adequately described her radical views, but she was an abolitionist lecturer when she was 25 years old. She was a Quaker, and she found the way, as they would say. And she went out and became a lecturer. She used to go to small towns where people, and talk about the evils of slavery, particularly to women, where she would tell other women, look, women who are enslaved lose their children, they're sold off, imagine that. And people used to throw manure at her, okay, or stones. And some towns tried to ban her from coming because she was apparently an incredibly charismatic speaker. She founded a couple of abolitionist newspapers. She raised huge amounts of money for the cause. And so I thought to myself, well, what if she were to come together in some way with Abraham Lincoln? What then? In Springfield, where he lived. And so that was the genesis of the whole thing. It really started with Abby Kelly. She got married and was known as Abby Kelly Foster.
Right.
That's what started it all. So it was an accident.
She's a fantastic character. In the novel, she's a vegetarian. The Sylvester Graham diet is what she ascribed to, which I had never heard of. And for our listeners, he's also the inventor of the graham cracker.
Correct.
So that's kind of an interesting fact.
Oh yeah, she was almost a vegan as opposed to a vegetarian. Yeah.
Okay.
She didn't eat meat, so to my understanding. So.
I mean, that was kind of a fun tension that you brought into the book, and I won't tell our readers why. They'll have to read it for themselves. But it was such kind of a fun thing. And of course I stopped and went, wow, that's really interesting. Someone to be a vegan back at that time must have been very difficult for them to find food. And you bring that into the storyline. I do want to talk about tension and how you bring tension into the story in such a way that creates such great pacing. So tell me about your process for bringing in tension. Do you look for facts? Do you stumble upon them? How do you wordsmith the tension into these political thrillers? Really, it's a political thriller.
Yeah, it's actually, and the Washington novel is also a caper, for example.
It totally is. It's also a court. You're also an attorney, and
Yeah.
then there's a court case in the book as well. So yeah, tell us about the tension.
Well, it's really hard to describe that. Let me tell you the particular tension I wanted to create.
Okay. Awesome.
Lincoln was very clear that he was not an abolitionist. He didn't
Mhm.
frighten people into voting against him.
Yeah.
But he said slavery was evil, and he didn't want it to expand into the territories, which hadn't yet become states. And he was walking a very thin line on that, right?
Mhm.
And so what I wanted to create was a situation where Abby Kelly Foster, would be accused falsely of causing a riot and prosecuted for it by the Buchanan administration. And she would go to Springfield and give this speech. And then she'd be indicted, and Lincoln would begin to be asked by abolitionists, well, if you're elected, are you going to pardon her?
And you can't give it away. You're not going to give anything away, are you?
No, I don't think.
Okay.
Are you going to pardon her?
Don't give anything away.
No, I'm not. Are you pardon her? And of course, other people were saying, if you pardon her, we're not going to vote for you because that shows you're really an abolitionist. Okay.
Yeah.
So this created a problem for him, and I think the tension in the novel stems from that problem.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I was like, this could absolutely happen,
Yep.
where people come together to create this situation that he has to somehow hopefully get out of.
Resolve.
Yeah. And this is hence the thriller part of it. Very well done.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to talk to you about my favorite character, Annabelle Carter.
Oh, yes.
Now, Annabelle is a very surprising character for the time. Women were not allowed to be strong characters, really, so openly, and yet you give Annabelle this stage and a big piece in the book. Talk to us about making that decision and how that fit into the time and fit into creating the tension.
Right. Well, I read somewhere that the detective she went to work for, who was famous, hired women detectives in the 1850s.
Really?
And it was just a little thing that I read. Well, I'm going to come to that. And so I thought, okay, well, why don't I create a woman? I wanted to have both strong male characters and strong female characters. And part of the problem with writing novels set in that time period is there were lots of strong women, but they're not necessarily famous as characters in history.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seemed to me that she could help look for the enslaved girl who had escaped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then so I created her, and I thought, well, who would she be? She'd be strong, we'd be from the South. She's from a border state plantation, and that provides tension too, because she would tell you, I'm an abolitionist, but I don't know exactly how it's going to happen or when. Okay, she was a wishy-washy abolitionist, as many people were.
Sure.
And then I discovered something after I wrote her character. I read more about the women detectives that had been hired, discovered that there was a famous one named Kate Warney. Okay? And Kate Warney turns out to be very much like the character I created. But I swear on the Bible, I never read about Kate Warney before I created the character. So
really?
Something about the time that pushed that character into being, really.
Mm-hmm.
And Annabelle was the name of my aunt, my late aunt. I picked it because it was an old-fashioned name, which I always thought about with her when I was a kid too. I didn't become named Annabelle. So.
Annabelle's a lovely name, and I thought, gosh, what a perfect name for a character in this era. And there's a little bit of tension too, where she doesn't want to be called Annie, and everyone wants to call her Annie. So I loved how that kind of comes together, and I won't say anything more about that, but that was a lot of fun.
Well, what about what her boyfriend was called by his mother?
Well, exactly. But you have to stop. You're giving things away. I want to ask you a question, and it might seem a little controversial, maybe. So there were two scenes in the book that I read, and I'm going to read them to you if I can. One is on page 118. Where Annabelle is talking to Polly, who is basically the slave who had raised her. And Polly is talking about the escaped girl, the escaped slave. Let her go. Don't go finding her. She has took her own life in her own hands. For the first time, don't be one of them white people always trying to help out. that struck me as interesting. And you say, again, later in the book, we have a similar conversation where someone says, we are all just a lot of white people trying to absolve our national guilt by doing things to supposedly help. So you did it twice, which made me think this is really on your mind. Do you, I mean, I know that today there's a whole conversation about it right now with Black Lives Matter, the book White Fragility. And so I wonder, did that come into play as you wrote this book? Because you wrote it, presumably you wrote these words a year ago, and then it went through the editing process.
Yeah, they were actually, it was in a long publication queue, so it was actually probably 2 years ago that I wrote them. Yeah.
Right. So when you wrote those words, do you think that back then slaves felt that way, that white people were trying to help them when they had no place? Is that what you were trying to say? Or what do you think was where did that come from?
It came from two things, I think. One is it came from reading about the fact that the Underground Railroad was not just run by white people. There were lots of Black people doing it and risking their lives to do it. Okay? That was one thing it came from. The second thing it came from was the realization that these people who escaped took a tremendous risk because they might be killed after they escaped. They might be brought back and whipped, and so they were very courageous people. And so there was some aspect in which they were taking their life in their own hands, and yet the narratives you read about it are, oh, white people helped them. On the other hand, what really brought this home to me was it wasn't quite so much in an early draft, and my son, who's a millennial, brought it home to me in our discussions about it.
Interesting.
He really did. He pushed me on it. And
Good.
so it sort of a combination of my own research and his millennial outlook created those scenes.
It felt like sort of merging today's thought, with the past, going back. So I found it very interesting. This is a very interesting time for your book to be released too, considering everything that's happening with Black Lives Matter.
It is. Originally I'd hoped it was going to be released last year, and then it got delayed, and then the COVID-19 thing came along. But as it turns out, it's being released at a very good time because we have an election coming up just about 160 years, almost exactly, after the 1860 election, which was on November 3rd. This one's on November 6th.
It is very interesting timing.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions, but I hope people read this book. I do think it's a good time. It's important to me that people read more about that time period. I love how much you brought in the facts. You were very good at teaching, and I know you're also an instructor, a law instructor, are you not?
Yep.
But you also teach a little bit of history on your website and on Twitter. In fact, you tend to do this really cool thing where you do trivia and then you give the answers.
Yeah, Lincoln trivia at the moment. Right?
Yeah, Lincoln trivia. I was like, that's really cool. Like, here's the question. Do you know the answer? Here's the answer. So that was kind of fun. You seem to be a teacher at heart.
And my favorite piece of trivia is not in the book, which is Lincoln had a dog named Fido in Springfield.
Really?
Yeah, and Fido has his own Wikipedia page. There's a photo of it.
Well, I'm going to have to go find Fido. Actually, that was one of the answers I saw on Twitter. It said that the answer to last week's question is Fido. And I thought, I'm going to have to go look further into that. Who is your favorite president?
My favorite president? Wow.
Do you have a favorite president? Maybe that's
I'm not sure I have a
hard
favorite
to choose.
president. Although I have to tell you, I'm currently reading Ron Cherno's biography of Grant. Okay. President I never really knew much about. It's a great biography, and it contains the most startling kinds of trivia itself. Such as one of the generals in the Confederate Army was the best man at his wedding. Okay. And one of the people who surrendered to him at Appomattox, not Lee. And I thought to myself, well, Grant's wife was named Julia, and I thought, well, was there small talk at the surrender? Did he say, "How's Julia?"
Right.
Just stuff, and you go, wow. So
is this your next book? Do you think we might see some reimagined Grant history coming from you in the future?
You might. Although I've also toyed with writing a science fiction novel. So
Well, that sounds fun too.
Yeah, you don't have to do any real research for it. Well, that's not true either, but it's a different kind of research. So.
Do you think that's part of the draw, is the amount of research that it takes, to write this kind of a book? Is that part of the draw for you?
Of course, because you can feel like you're doing actual work when all you're really doing is enjoying yourself reading a book or a magazine article. Or like if you go to the Lincoln thing, I wondered, well, who voted for Lincoln? What was the voting analysis? And there wasn't much. And I finally found a monograph called Who Voted for Lincoln?
Oh.
Somebody had gone back and looked at a lot of the precinct returns and so forth. And, like Lincoln didn't carry New York City. He lost it. Okay. Lincoln barely carried his hometown of Springfield.
Right.
He lost Sangamon County, which is the county, Springfield's the county seat by a little bit. So it just was fascinating to read. So.
It is. Well, and I love the fact that, we get to learn so much about history, but the other thing is that it asks a lot of questions that make me, as someone who is very interested in the presidents and history, want to go and read some more of that. In fact, I did buy that Grant book recently. So
oh, yeah?
I haven't started it yet, but
not
I do
short.
plan to read it. It's not short. That's one of the reasons I haven't started reading it.
No, it's not short.
So is your wife in the room with you right now?
She is somewhere, I think. Yes, she's sitting on the floor in the back of the room.
Okay, well, I have a question that relates directly to her. So I read somewhere, I think it was on Amazon maybe, that your wife is the first person who gets to edit your books.
She is.
And my question is this: is she very kind to you, or is she merciless with her red pen?
She's basically, you want to answer that?
No.
Wait a minute. She's not dressed for this. Okay.
I don't know if you can see me.
She's crawling.
Oh, okay, I'm here. It goes this way. Chuck, you need to change this part A by doing X, this part B by doing Y, and this part C by doing Z. And he goes, no, I'm finished with this chapter. I don't want to change anything.
I worked on it for a week. Go away.
He comes back an hour later. He's changed A the way I suggested. He changed B a much better way than I ever could have thought of. And C, he's kept exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's the generic way it works.
Yeah. So she's read it kind of chapter by chapter as it comes out.
Having someone on your side to read that before it goes out, that must be helpful. Is she also a history buff like you? Or is she going mostly for character development, do you think?
Yeah, she is. In fact, she writes fake biography novellas, like My Story by Helen of Troy.
That sounds very interesting too. That's a whole nother conversation.
So she's interested in history too, but she's also a mathematician. She taught high school math for many years.
Very cool. So you're both teachers at heart.
Yep.
I want to ask you, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question. You're credited as the legal script consultant to 3 primetime television shows, LA Law, The Practice, and Boston Legal, as well as the TV show, The Paper Chase. How did you get that gig?
Kind of by accident. Long ago, I was teaching at the UCLA Law School as a full-time professor at the time, as a visitor from practice. And I got a call from a friend who had gotten a call from Paper Chase. They were looking for a new consultant. He wasn't interested. And they decided that since I'd gone to law school at Harvard and was a law professor, I would do. At the time, I'd never read a TV script in my whole life. Now I've read hundreds.
Wow. Yeah.
It was a total accident, basically.
Well, it sounds pretty cool. Was that a lot of fun? Did you enjoy that?
It was really great fun. And also, I learned a lot from it because I read a lot of scripts written by people like Stephen Bochco, David Kelly, and a lot of other very talented writers. And so I think from them, I learned a lot about writing dialogue, not so much about writing description because there isn't any in scripts. So.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Well, I got to say, Charles, thank you so much for having this conversation. It's been so much fun to talk to you. And thank you to your wife for giving me her answer in person.
Okay.
Hi, Julie.
Hi. We've got some questions and some good comments coming in. But I was fascinated by the hiring of women and the veganism and all of that during like that time period. It's like, maybe we were a little more progressive than we thought.
Right? More than we know. Totally.
More than we know. So Charles, we're calling you Charles on here, but you have some friends on here that are calling you Chuck. So
That's what I'm often called, yeah.
So Hugh Heslip says, hi, Chuck. He and Holly and Roland are watching from Santa Fe.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so they're there. And then Dale Franklin says, you look great, CB.
Well, thank you, Dale.
And then we have a question. What is the next alternate history?
Well, I've thought about writing one, although it'd be rather controversial, about Robert E. Lee. You know, there was a big push at one point to try Lee for treason. And he was eventually pardoned along with a lot of other people by President Johnson. And so one could do something with that perhaps, although you would try to balance it out. And I know even saying you'd balance it out could tick some people off. But it was a very interesting time. And there's a lot of history. Some of it's in the Grant biography that I've been reading. That's just totally unknown because, again, just as with Lincoln was elected and then the Civil War happened, there's kind of a thought that, well, there was a surrender at Appomattox by Lee and then the war was over and everybody moved on. But in fact, there were a lot of years of Sturm und Drang in between and angst and recriminations and so forth. So that's another period about which there are not a lot of novels.
Interesting. Okay, then Susan Hoffman is saying, the puppies and I are watching from West LA, and she says, we want Sally Ann. So
well, Sally Ann spoke, so.
Yes, exactly. So you got some Sally Ann in there. And then Nancy Cohen, hi, Chuck and Sally Ann, finally got on. She loves the fact that you're talking about you, Sally Ann, and thinks you deserve a co-authorship is what Nancy is thinking there. And then Cynthia in Westwood says, I may not pronounce this correctly, Cynthia, Amelie was happy to learn about Fido. She couldn't understand why Fido wasn't a central character in the book.
The answer is because I didn't know about Fido when I wrote the book.
Ah, there you go.
It was a piece of Lincoln trivia, which when I learned about it, I said, how on earth, after all the books I've read about Lincoln, did I miss that? Because Fido would have been in the book for sure.
Right. And so Diane has a question. What time period do you wish you could have practiced law in?
Oh, wow, that's a really interesting question. I would have liked to have practiced law in London in the 1780s, which is when the whole system was changing in ways that made it like we know it today, but because before that it was very different. And that would have been a really interesting time to be there.
Yeah, really interesting time to live in. Yeah, there's some good. Yeah. Okay, well, that's it for the comment section. This was a great conversation. Again, who's got a copy of the book to hold up?
I do.
Excellent. There we go. The Day Lincoln Lost. I've got the link in the comment section, but again, you can get it from Warwick's, call us, email us. I should say email, online you can get it from us. Anyway, you can get a book and get it from Warwick's. So Jennifer, what's a good way for people to stay in touch with you if they want to hear more about your opinions on things?
Okay, well, you can check out thepremissepod.com and follow us on Twitter @podpremise. And also, hopefully, people will check out the San Diego Writers Festival. Our last event is this Saturday, August 8th, also on Facebook Live.
And that, you guys have, it's the publishing one this week, right? So there's lots of interesting, so if there's aspiring writers out there, this would be a good week to join in, correct?
That's right. It's going to be the business of publishing and personal branding for authors.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to get to teach a class this weekend, so I'm excited.
Excellent. Yeah. No, so that's a really good thing. So, and San Diego Writers Festival, find that on your San Diego Writers Festival Facebook page. Is that correct?
Yep, San Diego Writers Festival.com. People can also follow me at JenifferThompson.com if they're interested in my branding.
Okay. And then Charles, do you have a website or how do people stay in touch with you?
It's easy. It's CharlesRosenbergAuthor.com.
Okay, perfect.
And on Twitter, I have the handle @whomdoneit.com.
I love that.
@whodoneit was taken. And also on
Whomdoneit. I love it.
Have a little play on that one.
I hope people will follow Chuck on Twitter. I do, and it's really fun, just the stuff you're throwing out there. And I hope people buy this book. It's a great book. It's a really good time to read it. buy it from Warwick's. That's my
Yeah.
last little
Thank you.
plug.
And
Yeah.
Jennifer, those were great questions. Thank you.
It was
Oh my gosh.
a really
Thank
great
you.
conversation.
They really were.
And just
You
to remind
inspired me.
people, if they joined us late, this will stay on Facebook Live. You can see it there, or I will get it onto the Warwick's Books YouTube page this evening. It'll be there this evening for you to see as well. So with that, I'm going to sign us off of Facebook Live. And thank you, everybody. Good seeing you
And
guys.
thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And I'll stop the recording.